Thank you again to all who are able to join us here live. I am very excited today to be joined here by Brian Briggs from Hartford Funds. Brian, thank you for taking some time out of your day here. Most of you might recognize Hartford Funds from the portfolio. A couple of the positions that we are utilizing inside of the portfolio are with Hartford Funds, and Brian is a value add that they provide to our team. So I am very excited to be joined by him. Brian's a managing director of Applied Insights for Hartford Funds. Been with the firm about 6 years now and been in the industry about 20 years with an MBA in finance. So Brian, we are very happy to have you and very happy to have another perspective here. This presentation that we're going to do here today is going to be more focused on retirement, which, Brian, I'm sure you're doing a lot more of these days, given baby boomers and a lot of individuals now progressing into the second phase of their life. I've experienced this personally with my parents, right? And I've experienced it now in 15 years with clients of mine who, now transitioning, right, and trying to adapt to a new lifestyle. So Brian, thank you, number one, for joining us. As I mentioned in my intro, we're going to be about a half-hour presentation today. And, I'll allow you, Brian, to kind of kick us off and add any more color and background that you would like. And once you're done there, let's kick it off.
All right. Well, thank you, Shane, for the introduction. More importantly, thank you, everyone, for taking a couple minutes out of your afternoon to share our discussion today. So as Shane mentioned, when you think about retirement, typically you think about golf. Certainly now you think more about pickleball, whatever it is that you truly enjoy in so-called retirement. But we want to take a step back and say, if you could choose anything to do in retirement, who would you do it with? How would you get it done? And how would you avoid some of the pitfalls associated with isolation? So as we go through our presentation today, I'll certainly tap into Shane to see if he can provide some perspective, certainly as a financial advisor and professional and working with you. But then, at the end, if you have questions and comments in terms of kind of what your retirement is like and how you're able to craft it, make it your own, I'm happy to hear about that. So to kick things off, we partnered with an organization called the MIT Age Lab to help develop this content. So I think most of us know MIT. They're really smart folks up in Boston, the rocket scientists, if you will. But many of you may not know about the Age Lab. And so when you think about what this organization is that sits in the School of Engineering at MIT, what these folks are specifically focused on are two things. Number one, the challenges and opportunities associated with retirement. And so when we think about the aging process, let's take it one step back. We're all living longer, right? So as you think about retirement, at one point in our society, retirement might have been 10, 20 years. Let's think about maybe the early 1900s, whereas now it can be 30 or 40 years, right? Just that traditional retirement phase. So as you think about the challenges, certainly aging is something that we have to adapt to. For some cases, it can happen really fast, so we have to adjust. But in many cases, there are opportunities, right? When you think about, again, the freedom that comes with a non-traditional work week, when you think about spending more time with friends and family. So all these things are combined with offering solutions in retirement. So to give you a quick backdrop, it's better to tell the story in kind of illustration form than just say words. And what these folks are wearing, you see these folks on the screen, they're wearing a suit. It's called Agnes. The suit Agnes stands for Age Gain Now Empathy System. And so as you think about what that means and what that does, it looks like a Dickie suit. And in fact, it is a Dickie suit with a bunch of bells and whistles on it. But as you think about the aging process, you could say, hey, here's what I think someone needs physically in their mid-70s with a series of unmanaged chronic conditions, or you can actually feel what it's like. And so this suit's been retrofitted to give the experience of someone, again, in their mid-70s with a series of unmanaged chronic conditions, starting with the glasses, right? So you see them wearing yellow glasses. As we age, our eyes tend to tint more yellow. So something like having a yellow highlighter on a white piece of paper becomes more difficult. They're wearing Crocs, and not an attempt to be cool like teenagers, but the tactiles under our feet tend to wane as we age, right? So the gait at which we walk may be adjusted, right, in terms of having to scoot our feet as opposed to a traditional walk. The carabiners go from their neck to their waist. So imagine getting the cup of coffee that you get every single day in your kitchen, reaching up to get it, and suddenly it becomes more difficult, right? As years go on, it becomes really difficult. So again, that physical friction of getting something that I traditionally get, it's pretty easy, but now it becomes more difficult. So I could go on and on, but essentially this suit gives you that experience, just physical limitations of what it's like, again, to physically age. They're leaning on a car. This car is called Miss Daisy. So it's an autonomous driving car, which seems pretty normal today. When you think about 10, 15 years ago, this was, breaking through technology. And so when you think about collecting data, driving is something that's very personal, very sensitive, very intimate for a lot of us. And so when that time comes when someone says, hey, you can't, that's a friction point in life. So when you think about collecting data and doing research on how do we keep the people that we enjoy, that we love driving longer, not just for the sake of driving because they can, but how can technology help with that? So as we think about turn signal indicators, backup cameras, all the bells and whistles that are standard on cars today, well, a lot of that research was born in the MIT Age Lab, right? Offering technology solutions to offset the impact of the aging consumer. So again, we could go on and on about this, but essentially the folks here are doing research and providing opportunities and uncovering solutions to the retirement phase in life. The founder and director's name is Dr. Joe Coughlin, and in short, he has a quote here, but what he's saying, I'll summarize it, is we're all living longer, but we don't know what to do with all of that bonus longevity, right? There is a risk in financial planning called longevity risk, essentially outliving your money. But when you think about that, right, there's more than money that comes along with the retirement piece. So as we pivot to this, we want to talk about not just what it is to live longer, but how you can thrive in that phase.
Yeah, so I was just to break in there, for folks to kind of think high level about what we're talking about, it seems to me, right, that at the end of the day, we do, and all of our clients do, right, we are just there to advise and help and get them hopefully on the right path. We do a great job of preparing for retirement, right, in terms of financially, right? However, one of the things that often comes overlooked is, what am I going to do with the next 20, 30, 40 years of my life? And what is that going to look like, right? And I've personally experienced that with my parents. I know other folks here at Ausperity have, and I've seen it with clients, right? A lot of times folks are just not ready for all the free time that they're going to have and end up going back to work sometimes 1 year later, right? So I guess in my mind, right, the MIT, what they've really done is try to study how you can be better prepared mentally for the free time that you're about to experience.
Yeah, absolutely, Shane. And so as we think about kind of putting some wind behind that conversation, we'll talk about what 8,000 days is. There are phases of retirement, and we'll discuss those briefly. And then lastly, how do you actually prepare for it? So as we kind of kick this whole conversation off, we do live our lives in segments. So if you think about 8,000 days, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, Brian, no one's ever described retirement to me in days, right? It's typically in years. But as you think about 8,000 days, that equates to about 22, 23 years, give or take, right? So we do live our lives in those segments. As you think about the moment you're born until you go to college, you go to vocational school, perhaps even the military, that first phase of your life, again, give or take around 20 years, that's the learning phase, right? You're just kind of figuring out who you are. You're becoming your own person. You're following your own passions to a certain degree. You then kind of transition to the growing phase. And this is when you begin to have other people in your life, right? It could be a spouse, it could be children, it could be coworkers, right? You're kind of creating an environment of socialization. You're creating an environment of the financial piece, what it means to make money, spend money, earn money, give money, all those things. But then you transition to the maturing phase as you kind of relate to the idea that you're grown. This is not an age thing. This is just simply the fact that you can look back on your career. You can make some assessments. Retirement is a little bit more tangible to you, right? It could be 5 years out. It could be 5 days out, right? You kind of see it. You can look at the financial piece of your life and say, I could have done things differently. I've done things great, or perhaps I need to outsource this to a team like Ausperity, right? Moving forward to the exploring phase. This is when you begin to think about you're in retirement. Perhaps you've stopped working. Perhaps, as Shane mentioned, you're trying to go back to work, but you're making big decisions in your life. And so in many cases, this could also be a solo journey. And we'll talk about that in that, again, women typically live longer. And so what her retirement looks like may be very different than what their retirement looks like. Again, we'll talk about that. A quick story around this 8,000 day process. If you know sports, you know the name Tom Brady. Quarterback, played in the NFL, considered to many to be the GOAT, right? If you're a Giants fan, maybe you don't feel that way. But he had an amazing career, right? And so as you think about his 8,000 day story, he was born in the mid 70s, which from that time until he got drafted by the Patriots, it's around 8,000 days. To make the story even better, from the time that he was drafted until he retired the second time, right, with the Buccaneers, that time period in his life was also around 8,000 days. Now, what's key about that, when he retired the second time, he was 45 years old, which he was the oldest player playing at that point in time, still at a very high level. But as you think about his transition from playing the sport of football, again, one of the best, to TV, and he's still working out the kinks there, his 8,000 day process is a little different than most, right? So retiring at 45 and having a very long runway in quote unquote retirement, I think just puts eyeball to retirement is not necessarily a clear path, right? It looks different for most of us. When we work, how long we work, how long we support will look very different. Any thoughts there, Shane, before I move forward?
And this is it's very interesting. And that story about Tom Brady it's amazing that the math worked out exactly like that. So I'm interested in hearing more, Brian. Go ahead.
All right. So as we talk Tom Brady, I want to talk about some more practical people. The first being Jean Calment. She is the oldest person living on record. And so if you think about her life, she was alive when the Eiffel Tower was constructed. She survived the Spanish flu. She even survived both World War I and World War II. She was French. And so when you think about her life, certainly she wasn't looking to live to 102. Certainly she couldn't control what was happening in the world. But she was alive for a lot of what we experience in modern day history. And so as you think about people living longer, just think about, again, if you know someone who was alive in the early 1900s and perhaps is still alive, their story is pretty amazing. The oldest person currently living in the world, we had to have a little conflict with our marketing department because the person kept changing, every 3 to 5 months, depending on, how things would play out. So typically the oldest person living is a female, at least the past 5 or 6 people have been. So we have an image of a female because likely that person is a female today. Catherine Switzer, she's the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. You might recognize that name. She was able to up that ante and do it again 50 years later. So within her own right, she's defied age, she's defied longevity, and created a great name for herself. And then my favorite person, Wang Deshun, at 88, was dubbed the world's sexiest grandpa. And I think if you look at the picture, you might agree. So as you think about aging, sometimes, again, we look at the good, we look at the bad, but in many cases, what we experience, we don't have an impact on, right? And so as you kind of live your life, you live your life, right? And sometimes that impacts the world. In many cases, you do what you have to do. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about retirement in this 8,000-day process. To put some more research behind this, though, as you think about living longer, it's not just conceptual. The numbers do prove that if you are a couple that's 65 years old today, that you as a couple have at least a 50% chance to live to 92. So again, this is not something that might happen. A coin flip would say it probably will happen. So when you think about longevity, how do you prepare for that when you typically consider that, again, if I'm going to retire today, regardless of my age, I've got ultimate freedom. I've got time to be able to, again, spend time on the beach. I've got time to travel. Again, I joke around pickleball. It's something that, has become a sensation around the country. But this is a part of retirement. In fact, the folks at MIT would say this is retirement in a traditional form. It's just woefully complete. So when you look at what we see here, again, the fun stuff is a part of retirement, but there's still finances, there's health, there's, how do we give back our time? How do we fix the gutters? How do we do all these things that are, again, now on our plate, have to get done, but still a part of retirement? So again, as we kind of develop what our 8,000-day process is, we'll walk through the 4 phases of retirement, right? So once we're in retirement, here's how things look. Here's how you can be able to process things. Shane, any thoughts before we kick into this?
No, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm excited where this goes. Obviously this goes a little more into, financial and things, why we do some of the recommendation and advice that we give, Social Security, not panicking when the markets go down, right? It's one of those things that compounding in time comes into play in a lot of different ways, right? And Brian, this presentation and that longevity fact just, I think, reassures a lot of the things that we're advising and recommending.
All right, let's continue to put some tailwind behind the discussion. So as you think about the 4 phases of retirement, again, these are not autonomous, meaning that these don't happen exclusively at a point in time, but most of us will experience these phases one way or another. But the first being the honeymoon phase. And imagine this being the sheet cake party, the gold watch, you've done it, you're retired, everyone's celebrating your life and your career, and you go forth into the unknown. The second phase is that big decision phase, that once you're in retirement, now you have to consider that if a spouse passes away, if the kids move out, when the kids hopefully eventually move out, you've got some decisions to make, right? Do I upsize? Do I downsize? Do I move closer to my daughter because she and herself is having kids and I want to be a part of that process? The navigation phase in terms of, again, things will happen, right? Life is not a straight path. There's a lot of curves, bumps, and lows that go with that. So how do you adjust and adapt to those? Then lastly, the solo journey. So as we kick off the honeymoon phase, again, the role of work will change. I think in many cases, Shane, I'm sure you see this with your clients and prospects, that retirement is oftentimes a door that opens. It's not necessarily a room inside that door, right? Many things begin to come at your plate when that door of retirement begins to open. And so as you think about income and then dynamics of family, again, how you work and what you do will oftentimes determine that. As you think about remote work, this was a hot topic coming out of the pandemic. A lot of companies wanted people back into the office, but as you think about some folks, and my mom is a great example of this, she retired in 2019. My father was diagnosed with lung cancer in February 2020. We all know how the world changed in March 2020. She enjoyed the fact that she was able to be there for my dad, understanding that, caregiving was an opportunity, especially during that time, not having much help. But she quickly realized, right, once things began to open up, that she missed that social piece of work. It wasn't just the work that gave her satisfaction, just being in tune to what was happening, having the mentorship opportunities. So she went back to work in a remote fashion. So when you think about that, work is meaningful to a lot of people beyond the paycheck. The reason why people go back to work, again, finances can play a role in that. Sometimes it can be health insurance benefits. Sometimes it could be the socialization piece. But the reality is it's a multitude of options here. And so as you think about what your retirement looks like, it doesn't have to be full stop. It could be a slow roll, if you will, into what's called gray retirement, right? Pun intended there. You could reduce your hours. You could, again, tap into the virtual piece. You could say, hey, I'm going to work 3 days, volunteer 2 days. So all of your days are still filled with purpose, but just in a different traditional kind of way. As you think about the money piece, right? I want to talk about the club sandwich generation. So Shane, you talked about the baby boomers. In many cases, yes, the baby boomers are retiring, but the baby boomers also have to consider, am I ready to retire today? My adult mom is still living, still needing, care. So I have to kind of figure out as I retire, how will I make sure that she's good to go financially? But then also I have to consider my adult children, right? So maybe this is not the baby boomers, but certainly Gen X. The adult child, according to MIT, is 33 years old. So when you consider that, right, your adult child is figuring things out, right, emotionally, financially, spiritually, you name it. Mom and dad are still, at a place where we need to support them. But I also have to consider my own retirement, right? I have to consider, do I want to keep working? If I'm going to work, how will things get done? So this is a very difficult situation for a lot of people. And so it has to be addressed. As you think about how you will pay for retirement, again, as you turn the spigot off of income, in many cases, there's an unknown on the other side. So in many cases, people say, hey, I just want to be able to work so I can have a physical paycheck. Like, I like the idea of getting paid. It may be at a reduced amount, but I like the idea of knowing where a certain portion of my income is coming from. So before we move to the next phase, Shane, any thoughts here, in the honeymoon phase?
Yeah, no, I think that phase is something that a lot of our clients deal with, right? And that is certainly something that resonates, I think, for a lot of the folks on this call, and then also for folks that have listened to this thereafter. These are great, frames of mind, right? This is not an, instruction in any way, shape, or form. We always say, right, that it's investing, whether it's retirement, whatever it might be, it's not a one size fits all, right? So what we're trying to do here is just educate and, help folks kind of frame that mind. Brian, I don't know if Die with Zero book, right? But that's also something that we, that we incorporate, right? And just to try to get people to think about how can they not just live in retirement, but also spend their money in retirement, right? And right. I think these are all great points of reference, going forward.
Yeah, I've heard the phrase, I don't want to just live, I want to thrive. And so again, that doesn't end when you retire. So as we talk about the big decision phase, oftentimes we'll joke as I talk to people, I fly a lot. And so I end up sitting next to the most random people, but I'm always curious, like, hey, when you retire, where would you live? And the best answers that I often get is wherever, my spouse is, they point to their wife or their husband. Sometimes it's they want to be near the kids and grandkids. Sometimes it's look, not here, right? And so if that's the reality, you have to answer those questions, right? Finding your purpose, certainly in terms of what's your why, both today, tomorrow, and next week. And then how do you maintain access? And so as we talk about these questions, again, where you move, comes up often. If you live in the city today and you move to the burbs, but, kind of the suburban flight, your surroundings change. Perhaps it's a little easier to get around, but, Target may not be right next door, right? If you want a bigger property, you lose some of the access that you get in the city, right? So there's always trade-offs that you have to consider. But one of the ways MIT says that we can come to a conclusion about this is say, okay, what are the decisions that have to be made? No one likes the nursing home phrase. In many cases, though, it happens. As we talked about kind of that club sandwich generation, it may not be a nursing home, but having the wherewithal to say that, look, I can't care for mom and dad. Financially, it could be done, but it's just too much for me. So I have to outsource that. Right. So maybe this is a decision that's not made by you, but with the help of others. But having a plan in terms of what you want is really important. So as we think about all this, I want everyone to kind of think theoretically about the questions that you see here on the screen. And so the folks at MIT would say these 3 questions can help you determine your quality of life in retirement. With the first being, who will change my light bulbs? Again, this question seems, very generic. I've heard it, say it's kind of trite, right? It seems kind of obvious. Who's going to do the things that have to be done in the house? But if you talk about the aging process, if you ask 10 people where they would choose to age as they age, they would say in their home, right? 8 out of 10 people would actually say in their home. So if that's the case, who will get things done in the home? Not just who will cut the grass and who will change the light bulbs, but who will manage the home in its entirety. You might say to yourself, hey, I'll outsource that. But again, as we age, paying the bills, right? That's a task that has to be done. So again, who will do it? The second question is, how will I get an ice cream cone? And here on the East Coast, it's a very warm day, so ice cream and water ice sounds very appropriate. But the question here digs into, what do you enjoy? So if it's family, if it's friends, if it's, again, pickleball, if it's going to restaurants, right? How will you maintain access to those things for as long as you can? We talk about, moving, right? Imagine that you love playing pickleball. The place that you play pickleball is 5 minutes away. They've outgrown that facility. Now they moved 20 minutes away, right? So now you have to face traffic. Now you have to deal with, a different route to get there. Will it change the access point to which you get there, right? We oftentimes talk about, again, keeping our family and friends safe. If you don't love Uber today, here's what I would tell you about Uber. Uber protects your kids, right? If you're a husband, Uber protects your wife from getting point A to B. Uber protects your elderly mom from getting from point A to B, right? So the access is not just simply how will you do it, but how you leverage a universe to actually get it done. Who will you have lunch with? That's the third question. This really points to isolation. We have to avoid it. Essentially being alone for an extended amount of time is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. So when you think about the chronic impact of that, perhaps you're an introvert. Perhaps, again, you like being by yourself. Doesn't mean you have to be a social butterfly, but having access to people to check on you, to be in a social environment, to be able to give back your time, those are all really powerful elements to retirement. So when you think about these questions, again, they may seem very simple, but when you unpack the answer to these, as you talk to Shane and his team, you may get some really concrete financial and really social answers to these to help you sustain retirement. All right, Shane, thoughts here?
Yeah, from a perspective of these kind of questions, right? They're excellent questions, right? I mean, isolation, I think, is the biggest thing, right? That most individuals who are working at a company for a long time or went to an office, that's the number one thing they miss. Obviously, hopefully they have their spouse still, they have their kids and whatnot, but the water cooler talk, right? The small things, your work relationship, your best friend at work, the things that you were so accustomed to kind of dumping off on Monday, right? And just, venting. Sometimes they're not there, and folks struggle with that. So, this frame of mind is right up there with some of the things that, hopefully we can, help prepare for and help with.
Yeah, I love going to any, local donut shop, call it Dunkin' Donuts, and just seeing a group of guys just having, friendly banter about, I don't know what. But it's amazing to see that fellowship and that brotherhood or sisterhood, whatever it may be, with friends. All right. So as we talk about the navigating phase, again, this is your in retirement, right? You're figuring things out, right? Clearly, life is not a crystal stair. Things will happen. So as you think about health, again, chronic disease is a part of us. In fact, those 65 and up will live with at least one chronic condition as they age. The administration of living longer, we have to address that and who will help us. And then obviously, caregiving is a topic within itself. We could probably spend all day talking about, but we'll touch on a couple of points as we move forward. So as you kind of reflect back on your life, right? Let's assume that we're all 45 years old, right? And we're kind of in the middle of the road of life. You're middle aged to a certain degree. Think back when you were in your 20s, what you assumed aging would be like, right? So you say, look, I want to be able to have financial well-being. I want to have my health. And obviously I want to avoid isolation, right? And so I think that's the average of what we would say. But as you navigate retirement, right? Let's say you're 75 and up, you say, look, obviously I want my health, right? And it includes not just me, but other people. My cognitive ability is really important in terms of being able to make sound decisions, having my independence, having the control that I've always had. Then obviously the financial piece. So as you think about this, again, depending on your life, your situation, your culture, a lot of these could be kind of toggled. But again, the idea here is it takes money, it takes health, and it takes people to help us navigate retirement. As you think about the administration piece, right? I use the simple idea of using your cell phone. It could be an iPhone, it could be an Android, whatever it is. There's a lot of tools within a phone. I mean, it's a powerful thing that sits in your pocket and in your hand. But as you think about the things that you can do, right? Perhaps when you're younger, right? You can buy groceries, you can call Ubers. You can do all the things that you can on your phone. But think about as we age, right? Something as simple. And this just happened to my mom the other day. She said, hey, my ringer stopped working. And it was just a simple a button on her phone that she accidentally pressed, right? And so she was ready to go to the Apple store. She was complaining about what happened. And I'm not saying age was a factor. What I'm saying is when you have other things to consider in retirement, the little things add up, right? So when you think about, again, the ecosystem that you have to support you with these things, it's not just you that has to manage it. There's other people. And it really brings into the caregiving conversation, in which we typically think, hey, who's going to take care of me when something happens? Here's my question I would ask all of you to answer. Who will take care of you when something happens, right? Inevitably, life will happen one way or another. We should all have a first call. If something happens, who is the first call, right? When you think about something that you need, financial, again, social, whatever it may be, who is the first call, right? I ask everyone this question, that if something amazing happened to you today, who are you calling? Who's the first call to say, hey, I got a job offer. Hey, we got the home in Florida. Hey, you know what? We're going to Disney next month. Who is the first call? Because we all need those people in our lives. I give you another example. My grandmother, she's since passed away, but she was a fiercely independent woman when she was living. Even at the age of 96, she did not want anyone to help her. Here's what we try to do as a family, right? We would get groceries delivered to her to say, hey, the ease of driving, we didn't want her driving. She still did it, but we didn't want her doing it. But here's the deal. Get groceries delivered. They were right outside of our doorstep. She had a one-bedroom apartment on the first floor. The groceries would begin to pile up, though. So I would call my neighbor and say, hey, has grandma brought in the groceries? They would say, no. It's hot. The things are probably melting. Call my grandma. Hey, what's happening? She would say, hey, look, I appreciate the help. I really do. But if you're not going to come help put the groceries away, it's kind of null and void, right? So when you think about these opportunities, yes, technology can help. But there's also a void there. Typically, we have to be able to leverage people, right? You need people to be very aware of what needs to be done from beginning to end with these processes. All right, Shane, I'm going to talk quickly about the solo journey and then bring you in for some questions. But I want to be able to think about this in terms of kind of where we want to go, right? And the idea of living alone may not be something that's a reality for a lot of people. But if it happens, again, typically we think of women living longer. What does that look like? And so living alone allows you to kind of have a perspective of what needs to happen financially, what needs to happen socially. And sometimes we are widows, and sometimes we figure out and look at each other and say, hey, I love the family we've built. I love the years that we spent together. But the next phase will be on my own, right? So that's where great divorce comes into bear. And so whether it be due to circumstance or due to our own ambition, we have to consider what it looks like in being alone. And if you do so, you will revisit multiple phases. I think about someone who's cared for a spouse for many years, who's been ill, they pass away, there's grief, there's a void in their life, but now they have to say to themselves, right, there's more time on my plate, right? There's an independence. Do I want to date again, right? All of these questions have to be answered in terms of, again, how you will navigate that solo journey of your life. So you will revisit multiple phases. Where I will end is, as you think about the social piece, we go back to socialization and we want to avoid isolation. Simply getting out and doing things is really important. In one of the other presentations that we give called Retain Your Brain, we talk about the idea that if you can walk for 30 minutes per day, by doing so, you reduce the risk of you reduce the impact of dementia by 65%, right? So just having that information on your side says, look, I got to get out, right? If you have a dog or a puppy, right, just getting out forces you to meet people, right? You're not always friendly with everybody. I get that. But you're outside meeting people. You have an agenda. People check on you. If they haven't seen you in a week, they say, hey, where have you been? So with that, there's a lot that comes with independence. It can be a good thing, but we also want to consider a couple of different things. We peak at different things at different ages. So as you think about everything happening great in our 20s and 30s, that may be the case for some, but as you think about being satisfied with life again at 69, that's such a wonderful thing to look forward to. Having psychological well-being at 82, you've seen it, you've done it, right? You can write a book around every phase of life, but it's yours to share. So, being independent, having your own life, have a reflection piece is so important. But again, the piece here we want to talk about is doing it with someone else. Any thoughts or questions, Shane, before we close it out?
No. I mean, I think this provides a great frame of reference, right? And I think really that's what we're doing here today. It's funny you bring up Retain Your Brain. I just want to let everybody know that this hopefully will not be the last presentation that we're doing with Brian. This is supposed to be part of a series and kind of the initial one. It's not going to be every month that we're doing this in chronological order, but we are going to bring more material like this to our clients and, hopefully continue to build upon this conversation and whatnot, because, at the end of the day, this is really just starting point, right? As it is for a lot of our clients, right? From a relativity standpoint, they're just starting in retirement, right? And things are, relatively simple and easy when it's the first year or two, right? And it gets more complicated as you move along. So, Brian, I'll let you wrap it up. And then, just really quickly, for any individuals that are in here, please feel free to put some questions in the chat if you have any here, and we'll try and answer those when Brian wraps up. And then Brian and I will also just articulate maybe some takeaways here at the end.
All right, to bring it home, how do you actually do it? And I think the most simple way to think about this is, as opposed to thinking about how much things will cost, what will you do? It's almost like if you had a blank check to do what you want, how would you fill that check, right? Where would you go? Who would you do it with? What would be the things that, hey, I didn't have the time and while I was working to do it, but now retirement gives me the opportunity to kind of lean into that, right? And so every day doesn't have to be perfect. Oftentimes we talk about, avoiding perfection, but leaning into patterns, right? Leaning into things of good habits that you want to create. The money will take care of itself, right? And in many cases, if you have a good process, the money will allow you to do things. But as you think about this, have a purpose, have a plan in terms of what you will actually do with it. So, being with humans matters, right? An advent of AI, right? AI will help make things easier, but I encourage you to think about, again, your purpose is your purpose. That can't be replicated through any technology. And to close things out, right? We talked about here's what we discussed today, but I want to leave you with a quote. I think this really kind of brings it all home, that 4 phases of retirement enable a clear vision to plan and anticipate what is likely to come, right? Effective preparation can thereby reduce the stress of uncertainty and boost prolonged independence and control in the life so many wish to lead tomorrow. And this says, in summary, you have a plan, right? You've worked, you've gone to school, you've had your family, right? These are all things that take time, effort, and adjustment. Same thing applies to retirement, right? It's not a plateau. It's not a level set in terms of how you live the rest of your life. It's an open book. You get to create it. You get to write it. You get to have control over it every single day. So take advantage of that, right? I think it's a beautiful thing to end with. So I'll turn it back to Shane. Before I do so, really quick, there is a white paper and workbook that supports this. More research, more thought around what we talked about today. Brings it all together as you think about talking to other people. It's a great way to kind of summarize what we talked about, but then also share the knowledge and impact of living in retirement. So with that, Shane, I'll turn it back to you, and also thank you for the time and opportunity.
Thank you, Brian. That was excellent. Really, I think is just I keep coming back to this, but just a great frame of mind to help think about retirement, right? Because, at the end of the day, as prepared as sometimes we all are for what we think is every little thing, retirement's a long time for most of our clients at this point, right? We have a lot of folks retiring at 55, at 60, at 62, right? And as you mentioned, right, it's pretty much, a 50-50 chance at this point that one or both of you are going to live into your 90s, right? So that provides for a really long time, right? From 0 to 27, I only remember, right, from a mental standpoint, only half of that, right? So you think about it in kind of that frame of mind, and it's a lot, right? So, my takeaways, right, Brian, and maybe you have some as well, but again, it's just more of there's no right answer to this, right? There's no right or wrong answer. Everybody's going to do it kind of their own way, but I always encourage clients, and any of my clients that are on here, jot some things down, right? What's a week going to look like the first day that you retire, right? Maybe you have a little agenda, right? You're going to hit the gym, you're going to do some things around the house, right? But eventually, things that you have projects, right, that you always wanted to do will run out, right? And then it's, what do I do from there, right? And just keeping you social, right? Keeping you engaged, right? We, much like our process, right? We take notes, we learn about you, we put it together a plan, and then we implement that plan. Retirement can be looked at the same way, right? What are the things I like to do? What are the things I've always wanted to do? What are the things I need to catch up on around the house? And then put that to paper, right? And think about, hey, this is what the next 6 months of my life is going to be like. Not everybody's like that, right? Some people are totally good with just flying by the seat of their pants and loving and living life. But these kind of conversations, I think, Brian, really help plug a hole in that, this is a collaborative effort, but from just a day-to-day and and a social standpoint, we can't help as much as maybe we would want to, right, when it comes to folks and enjoying and thriving with their life. So thank you again. I don't know if you have any kind of ending thoughts there, but we really appreciate this, and I hope clients do too.
Yeah, the closing thoughts I would share is retirement is the first time since you were in kindergarten where you didn't have structure.
Yeah.
Right. And think about that, and for a lot of people, that's great the first time, but that wears off, right? We as humans, we like structure. So, having that structure, writing it down, as you mentioned, Shane, it's important, and sustain that throughout.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. And as I mentioned, we will get that white paper out to everybody so that they can have their hands on it. This is hopefully the first in a series of these that we're going to do, as I mentioned. So we'll have more ideas and more things to kind of expand upon when we go there. But thank you, Brian. Very much appreciated for being on this. I hope to see you again soon throughout the course of this year, talking about some other, fun longevity, retain your brain, social type topics for retirement. And to everybody on, have a great rest of your week. And thank you again, as always, for your trust and Ausperity and all the individuals you work with here.